from a really young age, I was very interested in what's real, in human potential, like a lot of us. Lying on the bed when I was 11, realizing that I was turning 11 and trying to really feel what 11 was like, and feeling my being that is no different at almost 62 now than at 11, and putting a mirror up to the bathroom mirror to see if I could see what nothing looked like, these kind of things. And my parents were a Catholic and an atheist. So I had the beauty and the symbolism and the depth and the energy of Catholicism, and the skepticism and the humor that my father brought. And those two things really, I think, feed into what sort of a teacher I am, which is to speak in a very grounded, experiential way. A lot of my exploration was following what was alive, following where I thought the juice was here and there. And I did a lot of what one would think of as psychological work. I did a lot of meeting what rose, because I saw that the places that I was not love or was not clear or was afraid had their roots in some kind of painful experience. And that if I met the pain underneath, those areas would clear. I learned this very young. I was 23, I think, when I first was exposed to something like this. And I was very excited because I saw that I could shed patterned things, shed suboptimal things, and allow my spirit to be absolutely free. And when I was in my 20s, I had a friend named Claire. I lived in New Hampshire, and there was not much that was going on that was spiritual in an alternative way. There's the Unitarian Church, which was, but a woman moved to town from Germany and offered a class called Circle. And we dabbled in things like meditation. And at one point she said, I want you all to envision what you want out of life. And people were envisioning sort of life sorts of things. Like, I'd like to be, a teacher. I'd like to be this. Mine was purely energetic. I had a vision of being a being in water, and that there would be no resistance, no filter to the light that I was emanating color in the water, and that I would be surrounded by these other beings who were pure light, emanating their expression through color with absolutely no fetters. So that gives you a feeling for what drives this, the freedom not only to know the light that we are, but the freedom to then express it, and to express it purely, to express it in a way skillfully. Because here I take the Ken Wilber, and I don't know if Ken was the first guy who came up with this, the clean up, grow up, wake up, all that kind of stuff. That's like my world, which is, how do we be the light that we are? How do we be the light that we are, unfettered by conditioned patterning? And then how do we develop the capacities to be an earthed light? For example, Ibn Arabi says, my heart can take on any form. I can be the Bible for the Christian. I can be the Kaaba for the Muslim. I can be the Torah for the Jew. My heart can take on any form. And the servant heart, and I feel this as I teach, it's like, wow, when the instrument is unfettered, when it's clear, when it's actually developed and mature, then that light can bring itself to bear in the most tailored way to this being. And so in that initial vision of being a light being, expressing, the freedom, it was the freedom, the joy of being the light that we are in the unique way that each of us is, sort of creatively and unfetteredly expressing and bringing that light and love to bear, heaven on earth, basically. I did all kinds of things. I did a stint through really studying men's and women's conditioning, first through women's conditioning and what is the most that a woman can be, and what are the fetters that hold us back from power and groundedness and love and clarity and all that. Just because I was a girl in the 70s when that whole thing was waking up, and that was huge for me, coming out of the limitation of those times on women into, again, this unfettered light being. And so I found myself really studying the dynamics of men's and women's conditioning and presenting at conferences and things, and leading workshops and things for women. And then I started to develop teachings about men's conditioning and how the culture conditions us within separation. When we reach for each other, we actually hurt each other. There's a lot to that, but the way that conditioning on either side of the divisions actually makes it very challenging for us to see each other as human beings in effective and skillful and grounded ways. So that was happening, and I was really breaking ground in what we call gender reconciliation. And that's when, I like to say, the Dark Lord of the underworld came and ate my head, which is a different sort of, my path has been very via negativa. St. John of the Cross details it perfectly, and thank God for him, because I thought I was mentally ill. I had no idea. Meaning drained from the world. Everything that I was lost juice. I was no one. I felt like behind a glass. I was not of this world. The world looked just like a show. And there was a deep descent and a deep reckoning and a deep stripping away, which lasted 4 or 5 years. But I didn't have anyone. No one knew what was happening to me. I had a couple friends who I had held space. We held space for each other together, and they just held a space for me to howl, thank God, without needing really to save me or interpret me. But everywhere I went, no one could reflect. My peers were Vietnam vets, people who'd lost children, basically people who had felt something in the world bringing itself to bear on their conditioned structure and cracking, which happens in deep grief or different things. But I had no cause. I was a happy person feeling like, God was my pal, and I was going to get my guy and have a baby, and this was all going to end, boom, And that's what St. John of the Cross says, is a true dark night of the soul is not caused by anything. It's caused by the holy flooding of the soul with light, and the dross rises. And the dross is the root of separation, which is war, which is something here should not be. Who I should be, who I am, war. And that, our psyche doesn't really let us generally down into where that lives in the engine room unless we're pressed. The protection of the psyche, the way it makes things unconscious, puts things in the shadow, to even get into the room with the depth of that. And that separation is just so reflected everywhere, including in, I like to say, the devil's in the details, including in the tiniest ways that we orient to our own being, orient to others, orient to our world. It's like we have this kind of these delusional blinders on that can be seen in every place where we suffer, because the suffering is reality calling us out of that divisive pseudo-reality out into the open. But the creature's frightened of that. It has established all this mental structure to have something to hold on to. So that happened. And in that, there were a couple significant moments. One was a moment where, when we're pressed by anything and fear rises, the mind, and I was a very mindy person, and I had a strong mind, trained in logic and philosophy and all these kind of things. And I wrote in my journal all the time, and I thought about deep things. And so when this hit, my mind went into overdrive to try to solve it, because the feeling was there's a lie here and I can't find the source of the lie. And for anyone who has a fine conscience, when there's a lie, you write it. I just didn't have really the tolerance in my system for anything like that. So the feeling was like that, but I couldn't find the lie. The lie ended up being the separate self, but I didn't know that. There was just this feeling of, I can't get to the bottom of whatever this is. And the force of the dark night just kept stripping and stripping and stripping identities, ways of functioning, all my mirrors that said, you're a good one. Just strip, strip, strip. So the shadow gets exposed. It was really hellacious. The mind was very strong. It was fighting, the mind and the will. It would rise. First, it would see, wow, meaninglessness, darkness, loss. Where am I going? No future. And I would wake up in this kind of active dread. And it looks a lot like trauma. And so oftentimes people who carry trauma hear me speak and feel very understood, because the realm of the dark, whatever sends us there, is common. But here, it wasn't the typical way we understand trauma. I never had overwhelming experience. I never had overwhelming terror and fear and shame and these kind of things that are associated with kind of trauma from this life. It was like the midnight bell tolls for you. It was like the Grim Reaper coming for me kind of a feeling. And the mind was very active trying to solve this with what I knew. And I was experiencing something I not only had never experienced, I couldn't find anyone else who had either. And this was very frightening to go to the experts. And I went to as many experts as I could. What the hell is this thing? And then I found St. John of the Cross when I was partway through it. And I sat holding that book. Mirabai Starr did a translation, and we were in the same sacred poetry class. So I begged her to let me have a pre-publication copy. And I told her if I found any typos, I'd let her know. And I read that thing, and I would just alternately sob and giggle like, oh my God, someone has charted this territory. And it's a valid territory, because at that point I had found satsang. And there was something about the energy of satsang. My partner was organizing for teachers to come to New Mexico where we were. And there was something about the energy. It didn't matter the message. There was something about the energy that soothed the creature of the body, that invited me in, out of division, out of the war, into just abiding, just being. And I ate that up like crazy, because what I started to find was that if I dropped my attention out of the mind into the sound of the birds, or the feel of the earth, or even some of the troubled feels in my body, or the ripples in the river, that the suffering would abate a bit. And so that, in combination with this message to just abide, I started to find a shelter. And there was one point, there were a few things that sort of happened. There was a feeling at some point that the mind and the will, as they rose and rose and rose and rose and failed and failed and failed and failed, and then fear and fear and fear and fear. At some point, it got so old that the fear started to fade. And the mind and the will got tired. And there was a moment where it felt like the backbone of the will broke. It's like, okay, I have no idea what this is. I may be mentally ill. Okay. And the fight stopped. And then there was a moment where the best way I can say it is that all that is silence, darkness, the unknown, in a way beckoned to me. It was like, it's not like there was a voice, but it was like a revelation. And the communication was, you do not have to go to that mind will thing ever again. You do not have to go there ever again. And when that happened, the mind and the will, that mind will thing rose up and said literally something like, you will be sick, you will be alone, you will be mentally ill, you will be dead. You'll basically be in a gutter. Without me, you're toast. But at that point, allegiance had already shifted. And the mind just looked like a little tiny barking poodle. And I was sitting as the immensity at that point. It was like pulling away. Just, it was a very quiet, very immense, very embodied sense. And with all of the work that I had done, allowing conditioning to dissolve, there was a sense of finding my legs in the present moment without a veil, without a plan, without a strategy. And I mean, not just long-term strategy. I mean, how do I meet this moment with this human as an utterly exposed, clueless bunny? Because that's how the body can feel, even though there's a sense of invulnerability about the consciousness. Then we come up to a person and we can feel the roots of the conditioning. And this is what many people struggle with. And many people come to me who've had big awakenings. And what they say is, but I'm still, but I'm still, but. And people think that they haven't had an authentic awakening or something because they're still a jerk in traffic, or they still have trouble with their father-in-law, or they're still up at night terrified or whatever. Well, it turns out that even though opening is timeless, we realize what we are. It's not like a process. It's like, that's the reckoning of that in the body, the growing legs under this wide open heart. People don't always talk about. They talk about the clarity, and the bliss, but it's rarely on the travel posters. The vulnerability, like when you think about how they call Jesus the Lamb of God, it's like the absolute tender, embodied sweetness of the way light and flesh marry in a human being. There's something so beautifully, vulnerably powerful. And because of our cultural bias away from all things yin, soft, we don't even have good words for it, weak, unable, all these things. The beauty of the powdered tenderness that is available as our structures fall, and the capacity to grow legs under that, and to allow the sturdy yang to marry the tender, open-hearted yin. Like, we are, in a way, designed in our full return to really be a marriage of these two powerful forces that, when integrated, the yin is sturdy, the yin is tender, the yang is not this Bluto yang you see in the world, or this power over. It's more like this absolute sturdy. It's the ideal of the spiritual warrior, the being who is, and you can see this sometimes reflected in main characters in movies and things. I think when I was growing up, it was Kung Fu. And I don't know if you've seen any of those shows, but David Carradine plays this half American, half Chinese boy who grows up in a Shaolin monastery. There's a lot of, grasshopper this and grasshopper that. But he plays a character until the character has to like kick karate butt, right? Until that moment, he plays an awakened being who is walking through the world quietly but sturdily, innocent and open, but with capacity to protect the innocent, etc. And sometimes we see this winking out in characters like Yoda, etc. And wow, the possibility of us when this light grounds and yin and yang both grow up and integrate, and we clean up, we wake up, we grow up, we show up. We have such tremendous potential. And as far as I can tell, the world is constantly giving us exactly what we need to call that out. And we don't always recognize it. And people can call their suffering something. We're trained to see, in a way, suffering is like something bad that's happening to me. But the way that I see it, it's the place where the limited sweater is unraveling, the place where the whole, the true, the real is calling to us. And then the argument of the creature, of the conditioned apparatus that is saying, no, no, no. And I feel post-awakening, if we can even use that term, a lot of people struggle with, how do I re-enter the world? How do I relate? Because so many things are different. And there are kind of tips and tricks to making it through this period. And maybe not everyone has it, because I don't know everyone. I just know a lot of people who seek and seek and seek light and light and light. And then bam, they hit a dark period, a descent, a deconstruction. And the vulnerability is confusing. The rising emotion is confusing. The how do I re-enter the world when all of my strategies are based on a delusional reality, but nobody's really telling me how to put one foot in front of the other out here as this squishy nothing. So that radical opening happened, and I laid low, kind of quivering and really minimizing, and throughout the whole dark night, really minimizing any relationships that I had besides my two friends who could hold space for me. I had a baby during that time, and she was as wide open as I was. So we were great company for each other. And I really allowed her lack of conditioning to be a teacher for me. She would say, well, what about this, Mama? And I'd be, wow, yeah, what about that? She would question aspects of conditioning, and I was able to really keep her company and her openness. So it was like an ideal pal to have at that time. She's 25 now. And so I just put one foot in front of the other, eventually could no longer do my work. I managed software developers at a local software company and took a dive into the unknown. And at some point in there, was invited to teach. And that was a whole odyssey in itself. And then the teaching has really, it's like, I think at first when we're invited to teach and we see how other teachers do it, we kind of do that like any craft or skill. It's like our mentors are our models. And just like Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud, after a while, Jung went his very own way. So there's been a lot of development in my teaching of what structure and methods make sense. This is not a mental thing. It's just everything that I am evolves through what I call fully engaged living and following what feels true, what feels alive. And so I've built a school, a wisdom school. A man that came to one of my retreats, he exclaimed, wow, this is one-stop shopping. Because my teaching is very inclusive. I meet people exactly where they are, wherever they are. I don't think that there's a kind of a one answer for everyone. In the moment, something is being asked for that is very unique based on the energies of that moment. The inclusivity includes the light, the freedom, us as consciousness. And it also includes every single way that we are trying to move through the world. How do I take this next step in a true way? And sometimes, it helps to have someone else have navigated, particularly relating, because relating gets really weird or can get really weird when our relationships with family, with friends, with lovers, with partners, with children have formed themselves within separation, with all the rules that go with kind of conditioned relating fall away. How do we navigate relating? How do we navigate a number of people meet issues of loneliness, belonging, these sorts of things? When we sit in our immensity, those things fade, but we can keep making the same mistakes, following our conditioned rules for how to be here in a good way, and just making messes or feeling funky. And so there's just a lot to navigate post awakening. And I have people, students who are just brand new to spirituality. Also, people who've done a lot of personal work, of embodied work, yoga teachers, dancers, people who've really done a lot of deep work, who sense sometimes that they need a spirituality that's inclusive, that where humanness is not seen as something to transcend, but that it is by design that light is coming to earth to marry flesh through us. That there's a deep beauty to that, and also lots of challenges.